Alright, welcome to Ezekiel, and we're going to go through your final. We're going to go through this quick, so feel free to print it out, have a pen, fast forward and rewind as necessary. Alright, number one, Ezekiel is specifically named in how many other books of the Bible? The answer to that is 0. He's not in any of the other books of the Bible, although his illustrations, allusions, the things that he prophesied are referenced and quoted quite a bit, but never is his name actually mentioned as associated with those. Ezekiel's name means God will strengthen. God will strengthen. Ezekiel was a priest from which family line? So that's Zadok. He's from the family line of Zadok. Which is interesting because at the end of the book, Zadok is the priestly line that is honored, as kind of the end times line, and in chapters, the last 40 through 48, right in there, Zadok is mentioned a few times. Number 4, Ezekiel was taken captive in what year of Nebuchadnezzar? So that's the 8th year. So this is 8 years after Nebuchadnezzar had taken his position, is when Ezekiel was taken captive, right? And then not long after he was taken captive did he have his vision, right? And then after he has his vision, then it was another 7 years to the destruction of the temple, right? What was the name of the river where Ezekiel and the other captives settled this? The brook Chebar. The brook Chebar. Number 6, list the 3 prophets who ministered at the same time and explain their setting, right? So now, obviously, there were other prophets that ministered at the same times too, but for this question, I'm talking about the ones specific for this class, right? So it would be Ezekiel, Daniel, and Jeremiah, right? So I will let you explain the setting, right? But those are the 3. You can go back in and watch the video on that. But and so I'll give you one of them so you understand what I'm talking about. Ezekiel was the prophet to the exiles who were exiled just outside of the city of Babylon. So I want you to also tell me the setting for Jeremiah and the setting for Daniel. Number 7, why is chapter 33 considered the turning point in the book of Ezekiel? That's when the temple is destroyed, right? So from that point forward, the book is a different tone and it's a different focus. Number 8, what is unique about the way that Ezekiel describes his prophetic messages? All right, so in this one, what I'm after, I'm sure there's a lot of unique things, but what I want for this question is the fact that Ezekiel not only gives the prophetic message, but he talks about how it is that he heard it, right? So a lot of times the prophets would just give their message, right? Ezekiel tells like what was going on as God's telling him this, and he gives the message, right? So it's we see kind of the reception of the message from Ezekiel's standpoint as opposed to just the giving of the message. Number 9, Ezekiel is the only Old Testament prophet who said that he saw what? So this is the what I'm specifically after in this question is that he said he saw the heavens opened, right? In the New Testament, we get that twice. We see it with Stephen, right? And then I think John the Baptist would be the other one, right? And I don't think in John and Revelation says that. So it's John the Baptist, Stephen before he's stoned, both say that. But in the Old Testament, that's unique. It's only Ezekiel, right? Okay. Number 10, describe in your own words what the opening vision of the 4 cherub and the wheel within a wheel means, right? So this one I'm going to leave on your own. We've talked about that one several times. If you need a little help with it, go back in and watch the video. Number 11, how long does Ezekiel minister before the destruction of the temple? So I gave you that one already. It's 7 years. Number 12, explain in your own words why God would have Ezekiel prophesy a message that he knew the people would not receive. So I want something to the effect that this prophecy, even though they didn't change, was to become a written record that God was behind all of this, that he prophesied it before it happened so that future generations would know that God was doing this in judgment over Israel. Right? That even though they weren't going to change, God was still going to be glorified as being the king over all of this. Right? Number 13. What sign was given to Ezekiel that he was to show the people that he was only speaking the true words of God? This is that God caused him to not be able to speak or to open his mouth. I guess he could open his mouth, but he couldn't open his mouth in terms of speaking. Unless God had just given him a word, and then he was allowed to share whatever it was that God had given him. So this whole time, the 7 years that he's ministering, from the opening vision until the temple was destroyed, Ezekiel was very limited in what he could say. Alright, number 14. List and give a brief description of the 4 prophetic actions God called Ezekiel to do at the beginning of his ministry to the exiles. So this is all the way back in chapters, I want to say 4 and 5, right around there of Ezekiel. It's one of the first lessons that we did. It's either week 1 or 2, I think. So go back in, watch those videos. I'm going to let you do that one on your own. But there were 4 distinct prophetic actions that Ezekiel was called to do that are covered in, I believe, chapters 4 and 5. Alright, number 15. Why is the phrase "the end has come" not necessarily a reference to the end time? So what I'm wanting here is that he's speaking to the people of Israel, and that sometimes prophecies about the end are speaking about the end of Israel, or the destruction of the temple, not necessarily the end of time itself, but the end of the nation of Israel. Okay. 16. What current Hebrew month carries the taint of earlier Jewish idolatry? That's Tammuz. Tammuz, Tammuz. That was the name of an idol, and somehow it's worked its way into their calendar, and it's still there. Number 17. And just to go back to that, the reason why it was is because that was the month of, like, one of the months of harvest, and so they would worship that thing during harvest, and they named the month after it, and it's still called that today. 17. In your own words, describe the parallels between Ezekiel's vision of the glory leaving with the symbolism of the Passover. So something to the effect that the glory was over the threshold, right? And it was very similar to the blood being over the threshold in Passover. The difference being that then now a mark was given on individuals who had the mark on them, and it wasn't just for everyone, right? And so I think that's the interesting part here, is that it's got several parallels to the Passover feast, except it wasn't just everyone is covered, it was just those who had the mark were covered. And so you kind of see some parallels between that story of the glory leaving and God preparing his people to come out of Egypt, right? Alright. So God's glory leaving the temple has parallels to God drawing his people out of Egypt. And right around that time, when the glory is leaving, God is going to bring his judgment, right? So just like in Egypt during the Passover, if the blood was on the threshold, then you were able to skip out on the judgment. And so we see a very similar concept emerging here right before God leaves in his glory, of receiving the mark, and now the glory was on the threshold, that kind of thing. So I did that whole lesson. But I'm looking for something to the effect that there was a mark in both stories that allowed you to bypass judgment. And the key, I guess, to understanding it is that in between Passover and the glory leaving, forgiveness was obtained because the glory was on the mercy seat. And it wasn't about, so the whole nation was being covered by the blood that was on the mercy seat. But when the glory leaves, it's not on the mercy seat anymore, it's on the threshold, which brings our mind back to how you were singled out at Passover. It wasn't the whole nation, because God said even if the Israelites don't put the blood over the threshold, that they will be judged. Or if an Egyptian puts the blood over the threshold, they'll be saved. And so when the glory was in the mercy seat, it was national forgiveness, right? Because the mercy seat spoke of the Day of Atonement, national forgiveness. But when the glory lifted up off the mercy seat and went back and put itself on the threshold, then all of a sudden you see in God sending out an angel with a mark. Say, I want you to mark them individually, those who are going to be saved. It's very strong parallels to the individual saving that was going on back at the Passover. Okay, number 18. In your own words, describe the parallels. This is a different question. It starts the same, but different question. In your own words, describe the parallels between Ezekiel's vision of the glory leaving and Jesus' returning glory. So what I'm after here is that lesson where we talked about how the glory progressively moved out eastward. And then when Jesus came to Calvary, from the Mount of Olives all the way through Jerusalem and then into Calvary and then eventually into the most holy place in heaven, that he was moving back westward. So as the glory left out the east, it's almost like Christ was bringing the glory back through that same path when he came. Okay. Number 19, what is most likely symbolized by the removal of the glory and the four living creatures in the wheel within a wheel? There's a scene, so you have the opening vision where he sees all of that, the ideal Israel, right? And then there's another scene later where he sees it again, except this time he sees it and it just leaves. It's no longer there anymore. And I think the point of what he's saying is that, you know, God wanted them to be a certain way and they refused. And so now that potential, that purpose is wasted, it's gone. The ideal Israel is gone. God has purpose in his heart now to judge them and to destroy the temple, and their role as being the light of the nations, they forfeited it. They didn't walk in that. Right? Okay. What does the reference to Daniel in the book of Ezekiel teach us? Well, one of the things it teaches us is that Daniel was highly respected, right? Even in his own day, Ezekiel references him. So it's kind of interesting that, you know, the exiles who were living outside of Babylon were aware that Daniel, one of their own, was number 2 over the government, living in Babylon, right? So anyway, it's kind of interesting that it shows, number one, that the Israelites who were in exile, who were living outside of Babylon, they knew about Daniel. Then the other thing is that Daniel was well respected. There's another place he's mentioned by an enemy king, and he's and you know, so that tells you that this enemy king's way on the other side of the continent there, and he knows about Daniel too. So it's kind of neat to see that. Number 21, Ezekiel 14:12 through 18 is very similar to what image in the book of Revelation, right? So basically what we're after here is this is the part that talks about what God's judgment is going to look like. And so basically these descriptions of God's judgment are almost word for word the same descriptions given in Revelation about the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, right? And so I think that there's a strong connection between this, that the beginning part of Revelation, that opening destruction, is this destruction that Ezekiel is talking about over Solomon's temple. Number 22, what reasoning does God give in the book of Ezekiel for why the city of Sodom was destroyed? So this is kind of a neat one. If you remember, we talked about it, that it wasn't about homosexuality, it wasn't about those perversions, it wasn't even particularly just about what happened when the angels came to view this city, that whole story with Lot and all of that. The Bible says that God had blessed them so much and they were so prosperous, but yet they refused to take care of their poor people. They refused to help. They refused to share any of their goods. They had become such a greedy society that God destroyed them. Right? So that's kind of an interesting thought. Number 23, explain the identity of the 2 eagles in Ezekiel's vision. So one of them is Babylon and one of them is Egypt. Right? The first one is Babylon, and it promised to take the top of the tree, which was the king of Judah, the new king of Judah, and plant him in a place, and he would have been fine. if he hadn't rebelled, but instead he put his trust in the second eagle, who was Egypt, and they weren't going to be able to help them. All right. Number 24 rather. Ezekiel chapter 20 provides what revelation about the Israelites' time in Egypt? So the revelation is that they had fallen into idolatry after they were experiencing all this blessing of God through Joseph. And so they fell into idolatry with what God was doing with Joseph, and then that was part of what brought on the slavery in Egypt, was judgment, because they had fallen into idolatry. Number 25, explain the connection between the prophecies against enemy nations and the vision of the wheel within a wheel. So basically what I'm wanting is, I think, the wheel within a wheel part is where I want the emphasis, the fact that there were two wheels. And so if you remember, I drew on the map that connected to Israel geographically were these 7 nations. And so I believe those are the ones that were called out specifically in judgment, that is the inner wheel. And then outside of that inner wheel is all the other nations that were also watching Israel. So it was almost like 2 layers. There were those immediately close to Israel that were connected with them. And then there's all of the nations beyond that form the other wheel. And all of them ultimately were supposed to look to Israel. But it's almost like 2 layers of it. So that first layer is the ones that are geographically bordering Israel, and they were called out specifically. Alright. Number 26, explain why the enemy nations around Israel were also judged. This has to do with the fact that God said that if Israel was the light of the world, that he would bless the surrounding nations, because they would know God. And so in some ways, because Israel was never the example and the light that they were supposed to be, these other nations never come to know God. So that's part of the answer. And then the other part was that when Israel was specifically judged, right, when Nebuchadnezzar came in and destroyed them, these enemy nations responded poorly. So some of them came in and did a money grab and tried to grab as much land as they could while Israel was weak. Some of them held celebrations and festivals to rejoice at Israel's fall. And so there's 2 things. One, Israel was not the light that they were supposed to be, so these enemy nations never really served God like they should. And then when Israel was judged, these enemy nations reacted poorly. Alright. Number 27. What future event is most likely referenced when God says he will make a covenant of peace with them in the future? So that's the 1,000 years of peace. Number 28, what part of the book of Revelation does Ezekiel's story of Gog and Magog apply to? So that would be the battles both before and after the 1,000 years of peace. 29, what makes us skeptical about applying chapter 28 to a metaphorical application of the enemy? So that's the chapter that everybody takes as being a reference to Satan. But the trouble is number 1, all the other chapters in that section are not metaphorical, they're very literal. And then part B of the answer is that nowhere else in the New Testament does any New Testament author validate that interpretation and say, oh, well, the enemy is like this because we know it from Ezekiel. So we don't see any validation of it in the New Testament, and there's no precedent for it in the Old Testament, because specifically the book of Ezekiel, because the rest of these chapters are not doing a metaphorical second layer. They're just giving a literal prophecy of judgment for these surrounding nations. Alright, question number 30. Describe in your own words the possible meaning and or symbolism of Ezekiel's vision of the new temple. That one I'm going to leave on your own, right? So I gave you quite a few things in that last class about the symbolism of this. I gave you 3 different possibilities. Right, so I want, in your own words, what do you think Ezekiel meant and was trying to show us by what he saw, or what was God showing us through what he showed Ezekiel about the new temple? Right? Okay, so if you have any questions, feel free to email us, and you should have no trouble with this one.